It was a dry October, and the last of the summer work had come to nothing. Hazel Vance had walked 4 miles in boots that were not hers, left behind by a woman at the boarding house in Pryor, who had gone west with a cattle drover and never come back for them. They were half a size too small. Hazel had wrapped her feet in strips of flour sacking before she put them on that morning. And by the time the road turned to dirt and the town disappeared behind the ridge, she had stopped feeling her toes altogether. She was not looking for charity. She had not looked for it in Pryor, and she had not looked for it in the 2 weeks before. That when she'd been sleeping in the loft of a livery stable outside Billings, helping the stableman's wife with laundry in exchange for the space. But the stableman's wife had taken ill, and the stableman had a brother coming to stay. And there was no more room and no more work, and Hazel Vance had thanked them both and walked out before anyone could feel sorry for her. Her mother had always said that a woman who kept her chin level would find level ground eventually. Her mother had been dead 11 years. Hazel had been keeping her chin level ever since, and the ground had been anything but. She was 24 years old. She had 14 cents in the pocket of her coat, a good wool coat that had been her mother's, and still smelled faintly of cedar, and she had 2 hands that had never been idle a day in her life. That was the full count of what she had. The ranch appeared at the bottom of a long slope, past a stand of cottonwoods, gone yellow with the season. It was not a grand place, a main house of weathered timber, a barn that listed slightly to the east, 2 outbuildings, a fenced pasture where a dozen cattle grazed in the afternoon quiet. But the fences were good. She noticed that. A man who kept his fences good was a man who paid attention, and a man who paid attention was a man who ran a real operation. She came through the gate and stood in the yard and waited. He came out of the barn before she had time to reconsider. He was tall and lean, and somewhere past 40, with a face the color of old saddle leather, and a way of moving that suggested he had been working since before sunup, and expected to keep working until dark. He carried a length of fence wire coiled over one shoulder. He looked at her the way a man looks at something unexpected, but not necessarily unwelcome, steady without alarm, reading the situation before he committed to a word. "Afternoon," he said. "Afternoon," Hazel said. "My name is Hazel Vance. I'm looking for work if you have any." His name was Calvin Drum. She would learn that a moment later when he told her, flat and without ceremony, the way men of his type tended to state facts. He set the wire coil down against the fence post and looked at her for a long moment. Not unkindly, assessing. "What kind of work?" he said. "Whatever needs doing," she said. "I can cook, put up preserves, mend, keep books, if your records need it. I can milk and tend chickens, and I'm not afraid of hard labor." He studied her boots. She was aware of how they looked. She did not look down. "There's no women's work on a ranch this size," he said finally. "I've got a bunkhouse hand, but he's leaving end of the month. I need someone who can cook for the crew when we bring in outside help. Right now that's just me and my hired man, Burkett. Come spring I'll need to bring on more. I can cook for however many you've got," Hazel said. Another long pause. A crow called from somewhere in the cottonwoods. The cattle shifted in the pasture. "Room and board and $2 a week," Calvin said. "Kitchen's yours to run. I don't interfere there." "That's fair," she said. He nodded once and picked up the fence wire. "Kitchen's through there," he said, gesturing toward the house. "I eat at 6. Burkett eats at 6. If you need anything from the cellar, it's unlocked." He walked back toward the barn. That was all. She stood in the yard for a moment, watching him go. Then she picked up her bag and went to find the kitchen. The kitchen was cold and in some disorder, but it had good bones. A cast iron range, big enough to cook for 10. A long work table, scrubbed pale, a window above the sink that looked out toward the barn and let in the afternoon light. There were dried herbs hanging from the rafters. Someone had known what they were doing once. There were canned goods on the shelves. Some of them dated 2 years back. There was flour and salt, and a tin of lard and a side of salted pork hanging near the back door. Hazel took off her coat, hung it on the hook by the door, and went to work. By 6 o'clock, there was a pot of beans with salt pork and onion, a pan of cornbread, and a crock of pickled beets she'd found at the back of the cellar shelf. She set the table for 2 without being asked, found the coffee tin, and had it hot when the men came in. Burkett was young, maybe 18, with the kind of face that hadn't fully decided what it was going to be yet. He sat down and ate with the intensity of someone who had been doing physical labor since dawn and regarded food as serious business. He said, "Thank you," when he was done, which she noted. Calvin Drum sat at the head of the table. He ate without comment. He had washed his face and hands. He drank 2 cups of coffee. When he was finished, he said, "Good meal, Miss Vance," and meant it simply, without flattery. Then he pushed back his chair and went outside, and she heard the sound of a lantern being lit in the barn. She washed the dishes alone and listened to the quiet of the place. It was a different kind of quiet from the livery stable, from the boarding house in Pryor. It was the quiet of a place that had once had more people in it, and had been learning slowly to be smaller. She did not ask questions. It had never served her to ask questions of employers, and she had a sense that Calvin Drum was a man who respected the same restraint in others that he practiced himself. The ranch had the feeling of a place where a woman had lived once. There were curtains in the front room, faded to the color of old straw. There was a china cabinet in the hall, with 3 plates inside it that were too good for daily use. On the shelf in the kitchen, there was a glass jar of buttons, all different kinds, collected over years, the way women collected such things, one by one. She learned what she needed to know by watching. He rose before dawn. He worked until dark. He ate what she put in front of him, without complaint, and with what she came to understand was genuine appreciation, though he would no sooner have said so in elaborate terms than he would have burst into song. When something was especially good, he poured himself a 3rd cup of coffee and stayed at the table a few minutes longer than usual. She came to watch for that. It was its own kind of review. Burkett left at the end of October, as promised. He shook her hand on his way out and said the beans had been the best he'd ever had, which she suspected was hyperbole but accepted in the spirit intended. After that, it was just the 2 of them, and the quiet deepened. She found her rhythm in it. Up before light, the range going, biscuits, or porridge, or fried potatoes, depending on what the week called for. Out to the chicken coop after breakfast. Then the kitchen garden, though there wasn't much left in it by November. Some late kale, and a few turnips she'd pulled before the first frost. She began going through the cellar properly, taking stock. There were gaps. She made a list. When she showed it to Calvin Drum at supper one evening, he looked it over without expression. "I can get most of this in town," he said. "I'm going in Saturday." "I can go," she said. He looked up from the list. "Town's 12 miles. I know it is." He looked back at the list. "I'll add it to my run," he said. She had not expected him to argue exactly, but she had expected something more than that. Some clarification of what the arrangement was. Some indication of whether she was an employee or a guest, or something else that didn't have a name yet. He gave her nothing of the sort. He simply added her provisions to his list and went to town on Saturday and came back with everything she'd asked for, plus a pound of dried apples she hadn't mentioned, left on the kitchen table without a word. She stood there, looking at the dried apples for a long moment. Then she put them away and started on supper. December came in hard. The temperature dropped below zero the first week and stayed there. The cattle needed checking twice a day, and Calvin was out in it for hours at a stretch, coming in with his hands so cold he could barely work the buttons of his coat. She started keeping a basin of warm water near the stove without being asked. He used it without comment. Gradually, this became a thing between them. The basin there when he came in, a small, silent acknowledgement that she had noticed and that he had received it. She made a heavier batch of bread that month. More stew, more bean soup, things that could sit on the back of the stove all day and be hot when he came in from the cold at any hour. She found herself tracking the sound of the barn door, so she knew when to have the coffee ready. He noticed. She could see it in the way he'd come through the kitchen door and exhale. Not dramatically, just a small release, like a man setting something down he'd been carrying. It was not nothing. One evening in the second week of December, she was mending a shirt at the kitchen table, her own, one of only 3 she owned, when he came in from his rounds later than usual. There was something wrong with one of the cows, he said. Nothing critical, but he'd had to stay with her. He sat down across the table and poured himself coffee and was quiet for a while. She kept mending. Outside, the wind had come up. It ran along the eaves of the house with a low, searching sound. "You from this part of Montana?" he said. "No," she said. "I'm from Kansas, originally. My father had a farm near Dodge. I came north when I was 17, alone, with an aunt. She passed 2 years after we arrived." He turned his coffee cup in his hands. "Parents? Both gone," she said. "Before I left Kansas." He nodded. He did not offer condolences. She appreciated that. There was something in false consolation that always made her feel worse. Not better, the obligation to reassure the consoler that she was all right, when all she wanted was to be left to the fact of it. "This place has been quiet a while," he said. She looked up. He was watching the window. The frost had come up on the glass, turning the dark outside into a kind of white nothing. "My wife passed 4 years ago," he said. "February." "I'm sorry," Hazel said. "She was the one who kept things." He paused. Knew every jar in the cellar, every seed she'd saved, every loose button. He glanced toward the shelf where the button jar still sat. "I didn't touch much of it after." Hazel set her mending down. "I noticed the curtains," she said carefully. "I didn't want to change anything without asking." He looked at her. Something shifted in his expression. Not dramatically. Not the way it would, in a story, someone was trying to make something of. Just a small shift, like a door that had been stuck for a long time giving slightly on its hinge. "The curtains could stand to be washed," he said. "If you were of a mind." "I'll do them Thursday," she said. He nodded and drank his coffee, and they sat in the easy quiet for a while, the wind working at the eaves, the stove ticking with heat, and Hazel's needle moving through the cloth with a small, steady sound. January brought a different kind of trouble. She was in the kitchen when he came in on the 4th of the month with his jaw set in a way she hadn't seen before. He put a letter on the kitchen table. He didn't say anything, but she could see from the letterhead that it was from the bank in Pryor. She didn't read it. It wasn't hers to read. He poured coffee and stood at the window. After a while he said, "They want the note paid down by spring, full quarter payment by April. I've been on interest-only terms for 2 years while I rebuilt the herd." She waited. "The price I'd need to get for the cattle in spring. It's possible," he said. "But there's no room for a bad winter, no room for losses." She thought about what she knew from 2 months on that ranch. The fences were good. The cattle looked healthy, even in the cold. The barn was tight. He hadn't been wasteful in any way she could see. "What would help most between now and April?" she said. He looked at her, a little surprised by the question. Not offended. Surprised that someone had asked it practically, without alarm. Reducing what we spend, he said, and getting the best price on the early calves. She nodded. She went to the cellar that evening and did a full accounting of what they had and what they needed for the remaining winter. She came back up with a list, not a complaint, just a map. What could be stretched, what they were near out of, what would cost them least to replace. She put it on the table beside his coffee cup without remark. He picked it up. He read it over. He set it down. "This is good thinking," he said. "I've kept lean before," she said. After that, something changed, or rather, something that had been changing quietly for months became visible. He began to tell her things, not confessionally, not with any kind of unburdening, simply including her. The price the Billings buyers were quoting, which cows were due to calve and when, what he planned to sell and what to hold. She listened. Sometimes she had a thought and offered it. He was not a man who asked for opinions readily, but he was a man who received them honestly, turning them over without defensiveness when they were worth considering. Once she said, "If you sold the 2 older bulls before spring, you'd carry less through the rest of the cold, and you could put that toward the note." He was quiet for a long moment. "That's not wrong," he said finally. He sold them the following week. February was long and gray and cold without relenting. The days ran together in the work of it. She had stopped tracking time the way she had when she'd first arrived. That sharp awareness of every week passing, every week she remained. Something had settled in her, not complacency. Something more like belonging, though she was careful with the word even in her own mind. He brought in 2 extra hands for calving season, young men from a neighboring operation, Deacon and Stroud, who ate enormously and were polite about it. She cooked for 4, and the kitchen was warm and busy, and she found she liked it. The house felt inhabited in a way she suspected it hadn't in years. One evening she was rolling out pie dough, dried apple pie. She'd been saving the apples for an occasion, and decided this was one. When Calvin came in and stopped just inside the door the way he sometimes did, as if checking the temperature of the room before committing to it. "Smells like something good," he said. "Apple pie," she said, "if it comes out right. When have you made something that didn't come out right?" She looked up. He was already looking away, hanging his coat on the hook, and she understood he had said it without thinking. The way true things sometimes got said. Quietly, sideways, when a person's guard was occupied elsewhere. She rolled the dough. He sat down and picked up the account book she'd been keeping, a thing he'd asked her to take over in January. Once he'd seen her list, and turned to the February page and ran his thumb down the column. "We're under what I'd feared," he said. "By $14, she said. He set the book down. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I wouldn't have made it this winter without your help, Miss Vance." She kept her eyes on the dough. "I'm glad to be useful," she said. "I don't mean the meals," he said, "though the meals are." He stopped. "I mean all of it." She looked up then. He was watching her, and for the first time since October, he wasn't assessing or reading the situation. He was just looking at her. "All right," she said, because it was what seemed true to say. He nodded and went back to the account book, and the oven ticked, and outside the February wind came through in its long gray way, and Hazel Vance thought, not without some surprise, that she was content. March arrived and brought mud and the sound of calves. The hands worked long hours, and she kept the stove going almost around the clock. She baked 6 loaves of bread at a time. She made soup with the soup bones she'd been saving all winter, rich and dark. And when Deacon came in one evening, looking like he'd been wrung out and set in the mud to dry, she put a bowl of it in front of him, and he looked at her like she'd handed him something sacred. "Miss Vance," he said, "I don't know where you came from, but I'm glad you're here. Eat before it gets cold," she said. which made him grin. She heard Calvin in the next room and thought, without meaning to, that he might have smiled too. The calves came mostly sound. They lost 2 in a bad night in the first week of the month. And she saw what it cost Calvin. Not dramatically. Not in any way he would have called grieving, but in the set of his shoulders the next morning when he came in for breakfast. She made eggs the way she'd noticed he preferred them, with the yolks broken and cooked through, and black pepper and extra biscuits. She didn't remark on the losses. She just put the plate down and refilled his coffee and let him eat. After a while he said, 23 new calves so far. That's good, she said. Yes, he said, it is. The first warm day came on the 17th of March. Hazel opened the kitchen window for the first time since October and felt the air come in. Not warm, exactly, but alive in a way the winter air hadn't been. She stood there for a long moment with her hands on the windowsill. From the barn, she could hear Calvin talking to the cattle in the low, easy voice he used with them. She didn't know the words. It wasn't the kind of thing you were supposed to hear. She went back to her bread. The note came due in April, as promised. Calvin drove the cattle to Billings himself, 3 days there and back, and she managed the ranch in his absence with a steadiness that surprised her a little. Not because she doubted herself, but because she hadn't known how much she'd been watching and learning until she needed it. When he came back on the 4th evening, she had supper ready and the lamp lit in the hall. He came through the door and looked at the lit lamp and didn't say anything. But he stood in the hallway for just a moment longer than necessary before he came on into the kitchen. He sat down. She put food on the table. Got good price, he said. Notes settled. She set down the serving spoon. Full payment? Full payment. A pause, interest and all. She sat down across from him. Calvin, she said. It was the first time she'd used his given name, and she noted that he noticed it. That's very good. Couldn't have done it, he said. The way this winter went, without. He stopped, started again, the account work you did, knowing where we stood, knowing what to cut. You knew what to cut, she said. I only wrote it down. That's not a small thing, he said. They ate. The evening came down around the house, the light going from gold to gray to blue, and the lamp on the table held its small circle of warmth against it. After supper, while she was washing dishes, she heard him go to the front room and come back. He stood in the kitchen doorway. I'd like to ask you something, he said. She turned around. He was holding his hat in both hands, turning it by the brim the way men did when they were working up to a thing. I know this isn't. I know it's not the ordinary way, he said, and I know I'm not easy company. He stopped, but this place is better with you in it, and I would be glad if you'd consider staying, not as the cook. The lamp gave its small, warm light. From outside came the sound of the cattle settling, and the creak of the barn, and somewhere in the cottonwoods the first tentative note of a bird that had come back early, feeling the change in the season. Hazel Vance set down her dish towel. All right, she said. I'll stay. He looked at her for a moment, not assessing, not reading the room, just looking, and something in his face went still and quiet in a way she had never seen before, the same way the land went still and quiet sometimes after a long wind, when everything settled into what it was always going to be. Thank you, Miss Vance, he said. Hazel, she said. Hazel, he said. They were married on a Saturday in late April in the front room of the ranch house by Reverend Aldgate from the church in Pryor, with Deacon and Stroud as witnesses and a dried apple cake on the kitchen table. It was not a grand affair. It did not need to be. By summer, the fences were freshly mended, and the kitchen garden had been planted twice as large as the year before. The cattle were fat, and the calves were growing, and the account book balanced cleanly to the dollar. Calvin still rose before dawn and worked until dark. Hazel still rose before him. The kitchen was warm most of the time, and the curtains had been washed and rehung, and the button jar on the shelf had begun to grow again, one button at a time, the way things grow when someone is paying attention to them. On a warm evening in July, she was sitting on the porch steps, shelling the first of the summer beans, when Calvin came up from the pasture and sat down beside her on the step. He had his hat in his hands. He looked out at the land, the grass gold and green in the long evening light, the mountains still snow-capped and distant and permanent. "You thinking about Kansas?" he said. "No," she said. "I was thinking about next winter." He looked at her. "If we put up enough, we won't need to run as lean," she said. "I want to try a root cellar extension on the north side, more turnips, more squash." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "All right." She went back to her beans. He sat beside her on the step, watching the last of the light. Somewhere in the cottonwoods, the early bird was singing again. Or one very like it, having found this place and decided to stay.